Good morning, everyone. I am Gabriella Dorlhiac from ICC Brazil. I would like to welcome all of you to our third meeting of the Practical Agenda for the Green Recovery, the Future of International Trade and Climate Barriers, a partnership between ICC Brazil and the Convergence Initiative. I know that this topic has been occupying the first pages of Brazilian newspapers and also around the world. And what we want to do with this series of events is to discuss in a very concrete manner, what does it mean when we discuss sustainability, the green agenda? What does this mean to Brazil's social and economic development? What are the roles of the public and private segment, how the world and Brazil have been looking at these topics, and this is why we have gathered a very, very relevant team of experts whom I will introduce to you right now. We have Mr. Maílson da Nóbrega, former finance minister of Brazil, also a signatory of Convergência letter. He is in the board of many companies. Cristiano Teixeira, CEO of Klabin, also in the COP Business Leaders, the only company of the Brazilian company in the world. He's helping to develop environmental, social, and economic guidelines for COP26. Damien Bruckard from ICC Global. And to help us in the beginning, we have Sérgio Margullis, the head economist of Convergence for Brazil. He has a PhD in the environment from Imperial College London. He is an environmental economist for the last 22 years, and now he is an associate of the International Sustainability Center and Way Economy. Sérgio, before I give you the floor, I would like to explain how this debate will take place. Each speaker will have about 5 minutes, and then we will open for question. So I want to encourage all our viewers to type your questions into the chat box. Sérgio, your CV gives us full credibility to discuss these topics, especially having you come from such a unique experience, which has been the Convergence for Brazil program. So let's hear from you before we start our discussion. Thank you very much, Gabriella, and everyone else for being with us. It's an honor to be here. And opposite to what you were saying in your introduction, I am here as a learner with such a bright team of experts. But I will make a brief introduction of some basic comments about the relationships between trade and climate, because these are the connections that will motivate this webinar. So a minute of some theory. The relationship between trade and climate is actually a bilateral relationship. They impact each other. So the opening of trade impacts economic production, of course, and consumption, as well as the position of production. So to begin with, you have a growth in the trade flows and economic activity, and therefore emissions of greenhouse gases occur because of the use of more energy. On the other hand, the opening of the trade also provides a greater diffusion of clean products and technologies. Clean products have a better access in different markets and countries, and their price also drops. Solar panels, wind turbines, for example, can be produced in Brazil at competitive prices because you can import parts and pieces from China and other countries, and therefore you have the low carbon products. And then, well, I will not be boring in the beginning, so I won't go into more boring details. So what we have is a certainty about this relationship between trade and climate. They help each other mutually to encourage clean products, or else the thing can go to the other direction where you have to negotiate trade-offs, etc. Before talking about the trade-offs in the climate point of view, of course, climate change impacts trade directly. You have the physical impacts of climate change, which impacts transportation segments, for example. They can impact the transport of infrastructure, products, and people in airports and highways, etc. But you can also have impacts on the agribusiness segment, and that will impact global trade. The example I usually give is that when Brazil has to start importing bananas from Siberia, or when we start to have to drink coffee coming from Argentina, that will be a total radical change in trade flows. But the interesting point that we will discuss in this webinar is more based on climate regulation and how it can impact trade. So all the provisions and legislations, the global climate regulations, and how they impact trade. So imports, prohibitions, and customs duties that are higher for products with a higher carbon footprint. They can become even higher depending on the habits and customs. We have the example of steel. Steel produced in China is very coal intensive and therefore has a higher carbon footprint, opposite from other types of steel that come from a cleaner matrix. And the same goes for soybeans, for example. The soy that is produced in areas that were deforested may not be accepted by other markets. So this is the actual world where we live. And to conclude, just picking out some facts, what we have in Brazil today is this dispute, or rather this issue or a reluctance from the European Union to ratify the free trade agreement that was signed in 2019 with Mercosur. That is, they are to ratify it because of the Brazilian government's sustainability policy, more specifically the Amazon issue. So that is the question which our three speakers must address. I don't know if they will answer directly, but that is something they will touch upon. First of all, we need to know whether this will become a standard practice or a trend, if all our trade agreements will hit on this climate barrier, if it will be translated into some kind of trade barrier or trade tax. And of course, this question for the current Brazilian government is a reality. They see the problem with the European Union as a non-tariff barrier or issue. But on the other hand, I believe that the environmentalist community in Brazil also understands and acknowledges that if no pressure is made, that the Brazilian government will not take the necessary steps to improve the Amazon, control deforestation, etc. So I believe all the answers I will pass on to the speakers. I'm sure Mr. da Nóbrega will have all the answers too. Thank you, Sérgio. I believe you did raise all of the points that are floating around us in air. Society has given important steps in acknowledging that this is something that needs to be more profoundly discussed, but we still have many doubts about how the legislation will be adjusted, how the international and global trade rules will be adjusted, and how governments and businesses will progress in this sense. I will begin with a very broad question so that we can hear each of our speakers in their specific perspective. The international trade agendas and the environmental agenda, can they work side by side? If so, how? We will begin with Minister Nóbrega, and we rely on your expertise to understand this. The global trade agenda begins to be more impacted by private segment organizations than by government regulations. Assuming the awareness that society is subject to catastrophic climate accidents and that this will impact life on the planet, this is the awakening of the new reality that is going on around the globe. And at the leadership, at the front of this process, we have NGOs, we have class associations, and even some businesses. I confess that until a short time ago, I was not aware that forests cannot resist deforestation. It comes to the point that there is no recovery, and forests like our Amazon would become a sterile environment or a savanna or a desert. And this is now known to everyone, and because if such catastrophe happens, it will change radically the rains all around the world, agribusiness, and of course trade. And it will be a threat to food security, especially in less developed countries. I would say that the agenda, the environmental agenda and the climate preservation agenda has spread out through multilateral agencies. And Sérgio knows this very well. 50 years ago, this would be a very strange thing, this agenda. And now it is a integrating part of all studies, rules, and funding. The IMF, which does not fund directly, but which has a very strong influence in macroeconomic management, has been a stronger and stronger voice in defending the environmental measures. I also think that this awareness is causing and originating a search for low carbon economy production, and this will certainly impact trade. We also must think about the financial aspect of this process, not only the trade of goods and services. This is something that has come up more recently. Financial institutions begin to demonstrate some concern, not only with a proper management of their resources, but to understand where their resources are being invested, in which companies, in which countries and jurisdictions. And this is something that is so new that the government simply hasn't noticed it yet. Here in Brazil, we saw pressure from foreign investors to fight against the fires in the Amazon and deforestation, and the government understood this as pressure from European organizations to close their markets to Brazilian products. But actually, these funds have been declaring that they will no longer invest if Brazil does not change its rules and behavior. But they are not defending any government or country. They are defending their own interests, because if they don't put pressure on the companies and on their clients, they will end up losing market. And we have another new thing, well, new in my view, it's been happening for 20 years, which is consumer awareness. Consumers are no longer meant to consume food products. They want to know where the food products come from, with which agricultural practices they were prepared or grown, and this may impact global trade, because you may have a boycott to some form of production that is not environmentally friendly. And this will certainly influence trade practices and trade rules. I have seen lately a kind of a perception which I believe is new and very relevant, which is the following. The private sector players and actors, they will end up influencing the behavior of countries and big corporations, even more so than rules or legislations. The perception of companies, their access to credit, if they are environmentally responsible, this will lead to the adoption of practices in the companies that will adjust to the demands of their investors. And that is why ESG is becoming so widespread in Brazil. I am so impressed in the companies which I have a seat at their board, or companies where my friends work. I have been impressed at how much ESG has become important. The banks as well are very much engaged in this. And another message that we have to take is that the private segment itself is engaged in the climate agenda, in the search for a lower carbon footprint. It will condition companies that up to now we thought were only adjusting themselves because they were ordered to by the government or by new laws. So I'm very happy to see that it's not only the government that creates rules, but rather the private segment, through its requirement for environmental responsibility, they generate rules that must be followed and complied with by the private segment. Thank you, Minister. There are several important points here, and I think it's a good opportunity for us to hear from Cristiano. Klabin is a company that has a sustainability repertoire that is not recent, and the whole segment, actually, pulp and paper, for many years has been betting on technology and innovation to put all these practices at a more sustainable level. And as the minister said, beyond rules and legislations. So what do you see when we ask a question that maybe Klabin and your industry has been dealing with for a longer period, whether the two agendas walk hand in hand, trade and sustainability? A pleasure to be here, Gabriella. I'm sorry we're not on live, because I would ask the minister to take a selfie with him, but I will tell people that we were together in this webinar. Well, Gabriella, I think it's exactly as you put it. Klabin has a very rich track record in this sense, and I need to answer you by putting things on a timeline. That's why I have an optimistic position. I am an optimist by nature, and even more specifically so about climate. And I'm sure that this will bring a positive impact to the public and the private segment. Just remembering that in the beginning of the re-democratization in Brazil, well, this is my personal history. Back in 1985, I was in the car with my dad listening to the radio about the elections and I remember that was my first my first approximation to politics ever, when I finally understood what was going on in Brazil. And 7 years later, Brazil was hosting the 1992 summit. Some people call it ECO 92, Rio 92, but the fact is that 7 years later, in a very beautiful part of our history, Brazil was being a protagonist in something that is still difficult to understand. We're going on to COP26, so that was a very important kickoff to have that starting in Brazil. And destiny also gave me the pleasure during Rio 92, Celso Laffer was the president of the conference, and today he belongs to the Klabin board. So it is somebody who I have a great pleasure to discuss history with. Anyway, I am very optimistic, as I said. I believe that the public debate is very rich, but it needs to be wealthier. Trying to look at things at as a glass half full, even in narratives, even when we have different perspectives, we always have some point in common, and I believe that climate is one of these points between the left and the right, and there is always this very important point of convergence, which is exactly what the minister mentioned here, that the reactions come from the planet itself. In our era, the planet is telling us that we cannot treat us the way we've been treating it, and we understand that, so we need to change. But how must we change? The private segment obviously does not have all the government bureaucracy. So it's easier and faster for companies to mobilize. If I want to deal and do business with other countries, I need to be certified. The minister was talking about the consumer's position. A short while ago, the UK started an environmental due diligence rule. That is, the products to be exported into the UK need to prove that they don't have any deforestation along their process. So the private segment adjusts, because if they don't do so, they will not sell. So this is not an environmentalist or pragmatic speech. It's rather a social aspect, that the wealth comes as a result of business and trade that generates jobs and so on and so forth. So my point specifically on climate now is to try to enrich this political debate. When this debate has to be rich, it cannot be superficial. So deforestation in the Amazon cannot happen. Illegal deforestation cannot happen in any segment, in any bioma, in any public or private segment. All illegality has to be fighted against. But why is nothing being done in this sense? Maybe we should broaden the debate to the point of discussing tax policies. Is Brazil healthy in its tax environment? Do the tax agencies, are they equipped to fight against illegality in the Amazon? Does this happen? Do they have the proper resources? So now, going back to history, if we really want to transform our nation, we have to touch upon the tax reform, the political reform, administrative reform, so that the country can comply with its obligations. We have a forest code which is very efficient. If we're not doing anything or monitoring or supervising, this is what we have to discuss. Why are we not doing it? Thank you very much, Cristiano. And I believe that the idea of events like this is exactly to discuss how we can bring a greater wealth to all these debates. And we can bring greater wealth to the political debate, as you said. We can find converging points. And I'm talking about convergence, which is not exactly the program here we have, but we may have different visions, of course, and perspectives, but the convergence point is that the environment is an essential pillar for Brazil as a nation, and there should be no doubt about that. Now let us hear Damien. Damien, you are from ICC Global, which is an entity that has been monitoring trade globally for over 100 years, and you always follow the idea that we should not wait for the governments to set up regulations. And so our speakers have explained this about the self-regulation that happens naturally in the private sector. In many organizations, the private sector, we know, is represented in the UN with a seat. Also in the UNFCCC, that is the UN's environment and climate areas. How have you, within the trade and investment policy segment of the ICC, how have you been bringing this topic to the group's discussions?
Well, thank you so much, Gabriella, for I'm having sorry, let me just
Maybe if you turn down the volume.
Da tecnologia, mas acho que a gente já vai voltar. Damien, are you with us?
If you turn down the volume, maybe.
I will.
Eu acho que o Damien caiu.
I think Damien.
Yes, sorry.
Go ahead.
Okay, I'm just hearing myself speak with an echo. So if there are problems on your end, please let me know. Thank you so much for the wonderful invitation, and my apologies for perhaps the world's worst start to an intervention. So, Gabriella, you are absolutely right to highlight both trade and sustainability as two of ICC's core goals. We are 100% behind the ambitions of the Paris Agreement, as well as, of course, being the world's business organization behind the idea of free trade. And so, when we look at these two problems, at first blush, it appears as though there is an inherent tension between pursuing the goals of trade and pursuing the goals of climate. But I think what we've come to realize as an organization is that we absolutely must find a way to be able to achieve both the Paris goals and free trade goals. And this is for a range of reasons. Obviously, the environmental imperative is beyond question, as previous speakers have alluded to as well. There is also clearly an economic incentive for businesses to clean up as markets develop with clean technology. It's very clear that there will be much more business in renewable energy, in renewable goods, in clean goods, goods and services more generally, and so there's an imperative economically as well. On the political side as well, what we've been seeing at ICC are some quite interesting trends, which we think mean that the global business community and the world writ large absolutely needs to move to a convergence of trade and climate change. Even if there were some countries or some business sectors that didn't want to do that, we think the political winds are blowing in a direction of its inevitability. With the election of the Democrats in the United States, very recently, the appointment of John Kerry as the climate czar, as they say, overtures from the European Union to the United States to work together on a border carbon adjustment mechanism. There are a whole range of different intersections of trade policy and climate policy, which we see as being almost inevitable, and therefore something that business absolutely needs to engage with. So, as to the question of how do you actually align trade and climate, it's not at all clear. Obviously, there are some policy prescriptions which in an ideal world could do that for you. A carbon tax, I think a global carbon tax, most economists would tell you, is by far the neatest solution. However, it doesn't seem to be on the political agenda at the moment. So we really see action in three areas as being necessary, but the trade policy settings, so through, and we can talk about this in more detail later, but through multilateral, plurilateral and bilateral trade policy, through cleaning trade itself, both the processes of linear trade as we currently experience it, but also moving to more circular forms of trading internationally, allowing businesses to have the tools that they require to map their emissions, to take action themselves, including SMEs. And then very finally, the third limb here is really about green financing. And previous speakers have already touched on this, and we can go into that in a little bit more detail. But we see three clear imperatives for aligning trade and climate, and it needs to be an absolutely holistic approach. But in the current political environment internationally, where the best solution is clearly not available, we need to be pulling all levers at our disposal, and critical to that will be the participation of the business community and the finance sector as well.
Thank you, Damien.
Now, thinking about what our speakers have commented here, I believe the big question today when we try to advance in this debate comes up as a concern, which is exactly that. Of course, the environment is important, but it can also quickly become an additional trade barrier. And this is one of the points that come up when we discuss the Mercosur agreement. Rather, how much of the concern would be really environmental and how much would be protectionist? Minister, you described the role of the private segment and investors and consumers in putting pressure on the Brazilian entrepreneurs and the Brazilian government to strengthen their environmental policies. Now, how can you avoid or prevent the negative side of that? Because we would need to have international rules maybe to prevent these rules to be used as an additional barrier. Yes, this is a possible risk. Protectionism is something that exists in all countries, even those that profess that they defend free trade. And protecting climate to lead to a low-carbon economy can become a non-tariff barrier also. But in general, I believe that this is the less relevant part of the process. What we have been seeing is a growing construction of rules that originate incentives. Actually, I was thinking about this. One of the books that I read when I was an economy student, The Armchair Economist. I don't remember the author. So the Armchair Economist is a theoretician, but with no experience. And he begins the book by saying, economic theory is summarized in 4 words. People react to incentives, and the rest are details. We're talking about the creation of rules and regulations and behaviors that create incentives to the good behavior of companies that are environmentally sound. On the other hand, I see in the design of tax systems a growing concern with the use of taxes to deal with any negative externalities that come from activities that hurt the environment, that increase the exposure to climate risk. So I have been seeing recently a combination of the environment, international trade, and also international finances. If you take the example of the World Bank, I would say that 40 years ago or 50 years ago, the World Bank would hardly ever fund the Trans-Amazon Highway. At that time, if the Brazilian government had gone to the World Bank, I'm sure they would have denied this. Today, the World Bank, as well as the Inter-American Development Bank, they have conditionalities that force the authorization or the release of funding to be associated with practices and rules that incentivize the private segment seeking to defend their own interests. As Cristiano said, the private segment will adjust to this new global demand, not because they have an attitude of contributing to the world, to the good in the world. No, of course, they want to defend their company, their market, their access to different markets, their access to cheaper funding and greater facilities. So that's it, actually. There is a complementarity between the international financial rules and the environment. Thank you, Minister. Damien, I will now give the floor to you and change the order so that we can pick up on this comment made by the minister that environmental protectionism is something that may exist, but then what would be the role of international Trade Organization. I know that there is nothing very specific about this, but for the ICC Global's view, it is important that the ITO, for example, includes these things in the international rules.
Thank you for the question. And when we action can be a non-barrier to trade. But when we think about the biggest barriers to trade are, and if you look at fossil fuel subsidies, 89% of global carbon emissions come from fossil fuels and industry in all countries. All countries that are taking climate action on the one hand are often subsidizing the dirtiest industries with the other hand. And so when we think about climate protectionism between what is happening in energy ministries on the one hand, and if, for instance, trade rules were able to require subsidies to be removed for things like agriculture, then surely we would be able to get them to be removed from things like polluting fossil fuels. And that's a great example of one of the non-tariff barriers to trade that the WTO is currently grappling with. There are discussions right now about how to liberalize discipline fossil fuel subsidies, other types of barriers to the liberalization of environmental goods, environmental services, and a shift to the circular economy. But as to the broader philosophical question of whether climate action can be protectionist, absolutely. And I think the role of an organization like ICC is to ensure that policymakers, when they're undertaking policies such as a carbon border adjustment mechanism, as the EU is doing, absolutely complies with international trade law obligations, does not discriminate on countries on any irrational basis, and has absolutely legitimate environmental objectives that are pursued in a rational way.
Thank you, Damien. Cristiano,
Cristiano, I think that one of the comments we see on our chat box are concrete examples. That is, all that in practice, what does it mean? How have the companies been adjusting? What is your experience at Klabin with regards to maybe a greater demands coming from your clients from outside of Brazil? What are their concerns? And how is the company planning or doing already adjusting to this new behavior? Thank you, Gabriella. Klabin produces paper for packaging and also paper packages besides pulp products. So we are a forest producer. Everything we do and produce comes from forests. What forests are these? They are planted forests. Therefore, we don't cut down forests. What we do is maintain and preserve forests. The Brazilian legislation is very clear about that. And therefore, in the areas that we can produce, like any other crop, like an apple plantation or any other crop, the forests are properly managed and they have the necessary certifications to receive the status of a renewable product. So these are the planted forests. I just make this difference because today, when we talk about having a deeper political debate, this also involves knowing where the products come from. Damien was talking about the rationality of the demands, and I agree with him entirely. We have to stop imagining things and speculating and think that protectionism can turn against us. But no, there are countries that still have protectionist practices. Not all countries are totally liberal, but there is always some rationality behind them, either on the part of those who practice the protectionism as well as those who are interested in selling or exporting. So a company needs to comply with the demands of the consumers and the countries that buy its products. And this is done by means of certifications and due diligence processes that are being established. Now, in practice, what does that mean? In the case of Klabin, more specifically, and to put it into context, our process helps us to have environmental services, as Damien has mentioned, and the law about environmental services came to us as a very welcoming thing because Klabin preserves 50% of the area where it uses and produces, and the other 50% is planted and managed. So we comply with existing legislation in Brazil, and there are new laws coming up for COP26 in order to regulate this as well as the carbon retention. So how does a company work with carbon footprint in practice? We emit CO2, for example, in our packaging production, but we also store and accumulate CO2 in the part of the forests that we preserve and manage. So we stock 4.7 million tons of carbon. So when we hear today a discussion about being carbon neutral, the Brazilian forestry segment, specifically for pulp and paper, in practice, are all these companies, by keeping their environmental services, and we need a lot of water, for example, in our operations. So this obligation to be productive lead us to be carbon positive. So all forestry companies in Brazil, with no exception, follow practices or have practices in place that do not cause any barrier. There is no restriction around the world to our products. And so I'm speaking about the government. It may sound like a critique, but is not. In the pandemic, e-commerce grew rapidly and the government rules did not adjust so rapidly. And that is how things are. Typically, things happen and get adjusted, and then the government comes with its laws and rules. And here in Brazil, it was the same. The companies are already adjusted. The minister was talking about the relationship between the private segment and the environment. But if I have to issue bonds and I have to deal with a financial segment, as the minister said, including the sustainability bonds, which we are one of the Brazilian companies that issue such bonds, all the restrictions that are in place for these sustainability bonds force us to act as we speak. So in the debt market or in the equity market, the long-term vision or strategic vision of the company will not happen if you cannot answer in the short term how you will be funded and whether these rules are based on the environment. So it is a direct relationship and a very productive one for all sides, for the global population and for the companies that have this as their purpose. Thank you, Cristiano. Sérgio, I will now throw you into this inadvertently, but I want to use your great expertise. So in what we have been discussing so far, do you see a trend? Do you see any specific point coming up as something that has to be worked upon? Or are there many things to work upon between the government and the private sector? Well, I think we didn't talk specifically about climate. We're talking about the environment and climate. But honestly, I do not have an answer right now. Maybe Damien could put this into perspective better than myself. But what I think is that, in fact, for the time being, we have a conflict, a conflicting situation. Opportunities for positive synergies exist in smaller number than the conflicts we see. Actually, the MDCs themselves have been discussed, the Millennium Goals. So, Cristiano, obviously, all the companies are running ahead. They are putting pressure on the agenda. They don't even need the government for that. But there is a whole group of other companies that are quite behind, lagging behind. So these are not very uniform blocks that we see. I really would like to be more optimistic, but I also think it's a matter of time. The minister said something that even makes us feel relief. If you look at the World Bank in the 90s when I was working, they were transitioning into these environmental demands and everything. And the general manager of the IMF was a colleague of mine in the World Bank. We both worked with environmental economy, and there is a sustainability line here that cannot be disputed. But as is said, the devil lies in details. So I don't know if I would have a more general answer regarding these trade-offs, which are very difficult to work with. What I think that maybe if we had a few non-tariff barriers to improve the climate agenda, maybe that wouldn't be so bad. But the truth is that the world needs to be cleaned. We will never solve the climate issue if we don't reduce emissions. And we do that by purchasing low carbon products. If you have products that are filled with carbon, that are cleaner, they're not the same. They have the same name. You can call it steel, but you have the dirty steel and you have the clean steel. I do prefer to resort to Damien and the other speakers to explain if it makes sense, if in sooner or later you'll simply have to impose more restrictions because there's no more space for that, and maybe that would be one way of accelerating the transition. If you simply say, I do not want Brazilian soybeans, I do not want steel from China, I do not want anything that comes from deforestation in the Amazon, I see it as one possible way. So, Damien, now that you have been provoked by Sérgio, let's get back to you. You have already mentioned that for ICC Global, non-tariff barriers for the environment obviously need to follow a standard and global rules that are very clear. This is a position that ICC defends. Now, considering what Sérgio just mentioned, that maybe such rules or barriers would help to speed up better environmental practices, actually, I will change Sérgio's question lightly, because we do see that countries that are less developed, that have still not been capable of adjusting, may be left at a position of disadvantage, because they need to put in things that need to be in place. So Damien, how can we balance this so that how will this become another exclusion factor, like so many factors we see in global trade? And how could this be framed within an organization, a World Trade Organization?
Well, it's a pretty difficult question that I don't have any silver bullet answer to, unfortunately. There are obviously trade-offs, but to come back to the adage from the minister before, I mean, people react to incentives, I think is a part of the answer here. I might answer it actually just by building on that and saying that there really, I think, will be a very strong movement coming out of Europe and also with the United States to use trade policy as leverage for achieving environmental aims in a way that Brazil has recently been affected by. But I think this will only get stronger and stronger and happen to more and more countries around the world. The sort of Brussels effect is going to get stronger, and there will be more countries feeling these incentives to green their economies. Even just today, for instance, the EU actually released their new trade policy strategy, and I was quite struck by the focus that it has on using trade agreements to achieve sustainability, the EU's defined sustainability objectives. So, just to put that in context, all of their trade agreements now have sustainable development chapters with commitments that the other party must adhere to multilateral agreements on climate, biodiversity, chemicals, waste. They address things like sustainable fishing, responsible business conduct, but critically also that they must ratify and implement the Paris Agreement. So, that's one part of the evolving ecosystem, trade ecosystem here. But you asked specifically about the WTO. The WTO is going to be absolutely, on the one hand, critical because that's where all the multilateral rules get written. But on the other hand, in some ways peripheral, because its consensus-driven approach, its large membership, realistically means that progress there is going to be exceptionally slow and much slower than the required rate to reach the Paris Agreement goals. It's taken the organization 20 years to not yet get an agreement on eliminating or disciplining harmful fisheries subsidies. This is something with harmful literally in the title of the agreement, and they still can't agree to that. So are they going to be able to move quickly enough on climate? I think the jury's out. And so then what is left is not just this European approach, but also plurilateral initiatives, getting small groups of countries together in clubs that gradually expand over time and bring in more and more countries. So a great example of that is a New Zealand-led initiative, which has 6 members at the moment, which deals with fossil fuels, subsidy reform. It deals with eco-labeling, as Cristiano was mentioning, and it also deals with liberalizing trade and